Have you ever wondered what drives individuals and institutions to cross the boundaries of ethics and morality in the pursuit of knowledge? What compels human beings to conduct experiments that inflict unimaginable pain and suffering on fellow humans? Delve into the chilling annals of history as we uncover some of the most brutal experiments ever conducted. Experiments that push the limits of our understanding of science, psychology, and the darkness that can reside within us all. So before starting this video, please like this video and subscribe to this channel for our future updates. Number 5. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Philip Zimbardo, a psychologist, is credited with carrying out the now famous Stanford Prison Experiment in 1971. This experiment was an investigation into the psychological dynamics of being incarcerated and being subject to authority. The purpose of the experiment was to study how ordinary people would react when placed in positions of power and subservience within a simulated jail setting. Specifically, the researchers wanted to know how participants would react when they were in charge or when they were subservient. The findings of the study provided some unsettling new insights into the quick changes in identity and conduct that can take place in people when they are put in situations in which they are in positions of tremendous authority and vulnerability. The Stanford Prison Experiment had a pretty easy premise to begin with. College students were recruited to take part in the experiment, and then their roles, as either prisoners or guards, were allocated to them in a random fashion. The experiment was carried out in what was essentially a prison cell, which was situated in the bowels of the psychology building at Stanford University. The participants were instructed to behave in a manner consistent with a real-life prison, which included adhering to a set of rules and procedures that gave the guards authority over the convicts. What took place within a short span of time was both shocking and unsettling to watch unfold. The guards, who had not been given any specific instructions on how to carry out their jobs, soon adopted authoritarian and even cruel tendencies, despite the fact that they had not been given any such instructions. They used a variety of strategies, such as psychological and emotional manipulation, degrading treatment, and humiliating the inmates in order to exert control over the captives. On the other hand, the convicts went through severe mental suffering and started internalizing their roles, displaying signs of helplessness, melancholy, and even rebellion as a result. As the experiment went on, the precarious nature of the situation got even worse. The guards' violent and abusive actions continued unabated, which caused the inmates' mental and emotional health to deteriorate to a great degree. Zimbardo first failed to understand the seriousness of the issue, and as a result, the simulated environment began to take its toll not just on the subjects in the experiment, but also on the experimenters themselves. The experiment was quickly stopped after only 6 days because the upsetting actions exhibited by both the guards and the detainees became increasingly worrying. The Stanford Prison Experiment brought up a wide variety of moral and ethical issues. In spite of the fact that the volunteers had given their consent to take part in the study, they were made to endure significantly more psychological distress than had been first envisaged. The experiment brought to light the thin line that separates scientific inquiry from the possibility of causing significant emotional harm to participants. Furthermore, the experiment quickly devolved into abusive interactions, highlighting both the force of environmental elements and the capacity for individuals to internalize roles of authority and power, even in an atmosphere that was under strict control. The findings of the study have spurred continuing disputes in the disciplines of research ethics and psychology due to the ethical implications of the study. The experiment's lack of oversight, as well as the suffering that was done on the subjects, is said to cast doubt on both its scientific and ethical credentials by its detractors. Zimbardo is the one who has admitted that the study had flaws, including the fact that he played a part in allowing the situation to worsen beyond what could be considered acceptable limits. Number 4. The MGRM Experiment. The key work that shed light on the intricate relationship that exists between human obedience and those in positions of authority was the experiment that Stanley Milgram carried out in 1961 at Yale University. This experiment was a pioneering study. The Milgram experiment gave disconcerting insights about the propensity of ordinary people to act in ways that are counter to their personal moral values when they are under the sway of authority. The experiment was designed to test the depths to which individuals will follow orders from perceived authoritative sources. The participants were led to believe that they were taking part in a study on learning and memory, in which they would play the role of the teacher. However, the actual setting of the experiment was deceptively straightforward. Their job was to provide an electric shock to a learner if that person gave the wrong response to a question. Participants were under the impression that they were receiving actual shocks. Nevertheless, the individuals they were observing were actually actors. The participants believed they were causing actual pain and misery to another human being, which was the central premise of the experiment. This was the most important finding of the study. As the experiment went on, the students gave intentionally erroneous responses to the quizzes, which caused the other students to administer increasingly painful electric shocks to the students. The catch was that the experimenter, who was seen as an authoritative character, encouraged the participants to keep giving the shocks, even while the learners were in excruciating pain and begged for the experiment to end. Surprisingly, a sizable proportion of the participants persisted in applying shocks, frequently reaching the highest possible voltage levels on the machine, despite the fact that they were clearly in pain and reluctant to do so. The results of Milgram's experiment provided compelling evidence of the potency of social pressure and submission to authority. Participants were presented with a difficult ethical choice. They could either listen to their gut feelings or stop causing harm to the learner, or they could comply with the orders given by the authority figure and continue. The findings disproved the hypothesis that only a small percentage of people would follow harmful commands, as the majority of participants showed a propensity to prioritize the directives of the perceived authority over their own ethical concerns. The findings also disproved the hypothesis that only a small percentage of persons would comply with detrimental orders. The results of the Milgram experiment have repercussions that reach much beyond the confines of the study's immediate setting. The findings shed a somber light on past tragedies in which individuals participated in acts that defied their personal convictions while under the grip of authoritative regimes. The findings showed the deep impact that situational conditions and authority figures have on human conduct. The experiment highlighted the possibility for regular people to engage in acts of cruelty and violence when placed within the context of a hierarchical power system. Nevertheless, the Milgram experiment was also responsible for sparking heated ethical debates regarding the possible harm that could have been done on volunteers. The experiment, according to its detractors, put the subjects through a tremendous amount of psychological anguish, which could have had a harmful impact in the long run. The fact that the participants in the experiment were not completely aware of the exact nature of the study added fuel to the fire of these ethical concerns. In response to these ethical concerns, the Milgram experiment was a defining factor in the development of modern research ethics and guidelines for the conduct of psychological experiments. Researchers are now obligated to adhere to stronger norms of informed consent and place the participants' health and safety as their top priority. Number 3. The Mutra Experiments. A bleak chapter in the annals of psychological and scientific inquiry is represented by the MK Ultra experiments that were carried out by the Central Intelligence Agency in the 1950s and 1960s. The major objective of the research was to create strategies for mind control and investigate different ways to influence the actions and ideas of humans. These tests made use of a wide variety of methodologies, such as the administration of drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and various other approaches to psychological manipulation. In spite of the fact that such research may provide useful insights, the Mutra experiments have been widely denounced due to the unethical nature of the way they were conducted and the severe suffering that they caused to the people who took part in them. The use of psychoactive chemicals, particularly LSD, in the Mutra trials is one of the most infamous parts of those experiments. At the time, it was believed that these substances may lower people's barriers to influence and make their minds more receptive to suggestions. Participants were subjected to the powerful and unpredictable effects of these medicines, despite the fact that they were frequently uninformed of the chemicals they were being administered. The effects were frequently devastating, with some people reporting significant psychological distress, as well as hallucinations and emotional upheaval as side effects. These drug-induced events left long-lasting scars on the mental health of the participants, leading to a legacy of trauma that will remain for a very long time. Another primary emphasis of the MGRM studies was the use of hypnosis. Researchers believed that if they could put a patient into a hypnotic state, they would have a better degree of control over both their thoughts and their actions. The use of hypnosis without the appropriate consent from the patient raised serious ethical difficulties. Experimenters adjusted and controlled the participants' conscious states while placing them in precarious settings designed to expose their vulnerabilities. As the pursuit of knowledge took precedence above the health and safety of the individuals who were a part of the experiment, the line dividing research and exploitation became increasingly blurry. Techniques of sensory deprivation and isolation were also investigated as potential strategies of diminishing the feeling of self that an individual possesses and heightening their openness to suggestion. The test subjects were isolated from the outer world by being placed in isolation tanks or confined to small chambers, effectively cutting off their sensory experiences. This extreme style of psychological manipulation frequently resulted in considerable psychological distress, anxiety, and even hallucinations in some of its victims. The fact that the long-term impacts on the mental health of the individuals were so disastrous highlights the unethical violations that are inherently present in the search of such information. The subjects in the MK-Ultra studies did not give their informed consent, which is possibly one of the most disturbing features of those trials. Many of the people who were forced to participate in these experiments were not informed of the true nature of the research being conducted or the possible dangers that were associated with their participation. This disdain for informed consent further underscores the disregard shown for the well-being of the participants and brings to light the skewed priorities that the project has. When viewed in hindsight, the MK-Ultra experiments serve as a jarring illustration of the moral conundrums that might surface as a result of the quest of scientific knowledge at the expense of human dignity and well-being. The objectives of the study, which were pursued with a callous disregard for the possible harm that may be done on the victims, were driven by a desire to get a better understanding of the workings of the human mind. The long-term psychological trauma that many volunteers endured is a testament to the ethical duties that must accompany scientific study, particularly when human lives and well-being are at stake. Number 2. The Unit 731 experiments. During World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army carried out a series of experiments known as Unit 731. These tests included a wide range of atrocities that were in violation of human rights and ethical principles. The frostbite and hypothermia study is an example of an experiment that stands out due to the severity of its procedures. In this experiment, victims, often Chinese, Korean, or other prisoners of war, were made to endure extremely cold circumstances in order to gain a better understanding of the effects that frostbite and hypothermia have on the human body. These victims had their clothes taken off and were left outside in the frigid conditions for extended periods of time, most of the time until they suffered serious frostbite. The objective was to find the most effective treatment approaches for frostbite and to collect data on the physiological changes that happened after exposure to cold. The victims endured a tremendous amount of pain. As they braved the sub-zero conditions, their skin became blue, and they endured excruciating pain and anguish. Gangrene would frequently set in, which would eventually result in the amputation of limbs. The experimenters monitored the evolution of frostbite and its influence on the body with a clinical detachment, ignoring the terrible agony and misery that the victims were experiencing in the process. These victims suffered severe physical and psychological abuse, which left scars that went well beyond their physical wounds. The intentional and methodical nature of the suffering in this experiment is what makes it one of the most terrible. The victims were not only subjected to terrible conditions, but they were also regarded as objects for scientific research rather than as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and respect. This treatment was in addition to the fact that they were subjected to brutal conditions. Their suffering was disregarded as a means to an end, which is a glaring illustration of how unbridled scientific curiosity may lead to the practice of sadistic acts. Along with the rest of the Unit 731 program, the legacy of the frostbite and hypothermia experiment is a disturbing reminder of the potential for scientific undertakings to be perverted into tools of brutality. It highlights how important ethical issues and human rights are, as well as the duty that people involved in research have to preserve the principles of compassion and respect for life. The victims of these experiments, who were subjected to unfathomable anguish, ought to be remembered not as statistics, but as persons who suffered at the hands of a system that dehumanized them and used them for its own gain. They underwent inconceivable suffering. They deserve to be remembered. Number 1. The Nazi medical experiments. The medical experiments conducted by the Nazis are a terrible example of the depths to which humans are capable of cruelty and the complete lack of concern for ethical boundaries. These experiments, which were carried out by medical staff working under the authority of the Nazi dictatorship during World War II, are a disturbing reminder of the repercussions of unfettered power and the degradation of moral values in the quest of scientific knowledge. In the larger context of the Holocaust and the perverted philosophy of the Nazis towards racial purity, the medical experiments emerged as a hideous extension of the regime's savagery. This was especially true when viewed in conjunction with the Holocaust. These studies were motivated by a poisonous combination of pseudoscientific rationalization and a desire to enhance medical understanding for military and ideological goals. However, the procedures that were used in these tests lacked any sense of ethics or humanity in any way, shape, or form. The Nazi dictatorship was responsible for a horrifyingly wide variety of experiments during their regime. In the name of so-called scientific inquiry, unspeakable torment was inflicted upon the victims, the majority of whom were taken from concentration camps, and who mostly consisted of Jews, Roma, and other members of underrepresented groups. The lack of consent from the participants was possibly one of the features of these trials that was the most unsettling. The victims were frequently put through inhumane or painful experiences, including being made vulnerable to infections, toxins, and experimental treatments without their knowledge or consent. These defenseless patients were used as mere instruments by the Nazi doctors, who were indifferent to their suffering, their rights, and even their own lives. The idea of racial purity, which was fundamental to the ideology of the Nazi Party, was actualized in these experiments through the use of eugenics-related research. A callous disrespect for the dignity of the people who were subjected to forced sterilizations, artificial inseminations, and attempts to influence inherited features was shown during the course of these experiments. Those who made it through the ordeal were left with mental as well as physical scars as a result of the anguish imposed on them, which will forever cloud their recollections. Experiments at high altitude, which were carried out to assist military aircraft, exposed the test subjects to the harsh circumstances at high altitudes without providing them with the appropriate protection. The excruciating agony and suffering that these folks had to go through was disregarded as something that could be sacrificed for the purported improvement of scientific understanding. In order to further the perverted agenda of a tyrannical regime, the ethical principles that should have been used to direct medical practice were cast aside. Following the collapse of the Nazi dictatorship, the horrific nature of the Nazis' medical experimentation became public knowledge. These atrocities were addressed as part of the larger reckoning for the Holocaust that took place during the Nuremberg trials, which were held to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. The trials shed light on the full scope of the abuse, and a significant number of the healthcare providers responsible were brought to account for their roles in the scandal. The legacy of these experiments should serve as a stern caution to anyone working in the fields of science and medicine. They highlight how absolutely necessary it is to adhere to ethical norms and protect the health and rights of every individual who participates in research. When ethics and compassion are put aside, science has the potential to become a weapon of terror. The atrocities that have been committed in the name of furthering human knowledge stand as a monument to this potential. In the wake of the medical experiments conducted by the Nazis, there has been a deliberate attempt to develop strong ethical norms for medical research. The Nuremberg Code is a set of principles that came about as a result of the trials, and it places an emphasis on the significance of voluntary participation, informed consent, and the well-being of trial participants. These guiding principles have evolved into the cornerstone of contemporary research ethics, helping to ensure that the blunders of the past will never be repeated. The medical experiments carried out by the Nazis will forever leave a stain on the history of medicine and serve as a sobering reminder of the dire repercussions of unrestrained power, ideology, and the blurring of lines between right and wrong. They bring attention to the significance of maintaining vigilance in order to safeguard human rights and ethical norms in scientific activities. As we face the ethical concerns of our time, the spectral residue of these experiments serves as a potent reminder of the responsibility that we carry to ensuring that science and research always promote the improvement of humanity, rather than the destruction of it. What do you think of our video? Let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear from me again, be sure to hit that subscribe button before you go. Thanks for watching.